It's November 1941. We're in Leningrad. This great Russian city has been known by many names: St. Petersburg, Petrograd, but now it's named after the architect of the 1917 revolution, Vladimir Lenin. Much like its namesake, the city itself is in a bad way. Almost completely cut off since September, food rations are now all but exhausted. The city is starving. Let it starve, Hitler says. To use his own words, we have no interest in saving the lives of the civilian population. For the 2.5 million citizens trapped within, the whole affair is nothing short of hell. They patiently queue up to hours for bread rations each day, 4 ounces of the stuff per person, and as time passes, it becomes bread in name only, fattened with glue and sawdust. Then, even that begins to dry up. The people consume what they can to stay alive: cats, dogs, pigeons, leather belts, the soles of boots. Those with money sicken and die alongside those without. Who needs rubles when there's nothing to buy? 5-year-old Yevgenia Boyanova hurries through the bombed-out streets, clutching the hand of her elder sister, Maya. They are headed for the market to trade their meagre possessions for whatever scraps of food may be left. But even this trip is fraught with danger. The hunger is driving people mad, so the rumours go. Folks are being murdered for ration cards, lives snuffed out for a few more ounces of rancid bread a day. But Yevgenia has not lost the innocence of childhood. For her, there is still wonder to be found in this place, populated by the dead and the half-living. A distant rumble in the frigid sky, and Yevgenia raises her eyes towards it. A plane, soaring high above the forsaken city. Her hand slips from Maya's grip, and she stares with wonder at the machine, only vaguely aware of what it is. A woman approaches her, breaking the distraction. "Little one," she says, "wouldn't you like some candy?" Yevgenia would love some candy, the faint memory of its sweetness flooding back to her. She nods eagerly, and the woman grabs her roughly by the hand. With this, a scream rips through the air. It's Maya, running towards her, waving her arms desperately. The woman's hand recedes, and she melts away into the crowd. Maya pulls her sister close, holds her tight. This is what it's come to. In a city with nothing left, human beings are being snatched off the street, imprisoned, slaughtered for meat, and lone 5-year-olds like Yevgenia are the easiest target. The siege is barely 2 months old. It will be more than 2 years until it's finally broken, when the Red Army begins driving the Axis forces back westwards on the long road to Berlin. The nightmare is just beginning, and before it's over, more than 1 million people will lie dead. This is the story of the Siege of Leningrad. On June 22nd, 1941, the flimsy non-aggression pact between Germany and the Soviets evaporated. 3 million German troops poured over the border with 3,000 tanks and 2,500 planes. 30 divisions of Finnish and Romanian troops joined them. It was the largest invasion force in human history, its full force bearing down on the USSR. By September, Axis forces were approaching Leningrad. The German advance from the south was matched by a Finnish advance from the north, and when the fortress at Schlüsselburg fell on September 15th, the city was basically surrounded. The advance halted, and then the Luftwaffe took over. On the 19th, German planes hammered the city. 1,000 died that day alone, the raid striking homes and hospitals indiscriminately. Many of the dead were wounded soldiers, back from the front, defenceless in their hospital beds as German bombs crashed down on top of them. Leningrad's population braced for a final assault, but it never came. With 200,000 Soviet troops still within the city, the German Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, was reluctant to push into Leningrad. The Finns weren't interested in bloody, drawn-out urban warfare either. They'd retaken the territory lost during the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, and so on September 7th, They stopped their advance at the fortified Karelian region. To quote the historian Jesse Alexander, the Finns were a little bit cautious. They didn't want to go all out. They hedged their bets, which turned out in the future to be a very, very good idea for them. So the Germans set about playing the long game, squeezing the life out of the city caught between the Baltic Sea to the west and Lake Ladoga to the east. This lake became key to Leningrad's survival, covering more than 17,000 square kilometers. Ladoga was a barrier, preventing total Axis control of the city's eastern flank. But it was also a lifeline, Leningrad's only connection with the Red Army at the Volkhov front, and to the rest of the Soviet Union beyond. A huge Soviet flotilla began ferrying supplies across the water, but the German Air Force wasn't going to sit back and just let this happen. Planes roared overhead, seeking to shatter the convoys with bullet and bomb. On the coastline around Schisselburg, artillery kept up a near-constant barrage. But let's not forget just what Germany was dealing with here. They might have had the largest invasion force in history, but they were fighting on numerous fronts across a vast landmass. With the Germans stretched thin, the Soviets had the slimmest of chances, and thanks to the bravery and tenacity of those flotilla crews, supplies were getting through. The German High Command rethought its position. What if, rather than swatting at flies out on the lake, they could cut off the supply lines altogether? If they could sever that artery, they could bleed Leningrad dry. And so that's exactly what they did. A bold push eastwards drove deep into the Russian lines southeast of the lake, and German forces took the town of Tikhvin on November the 9th. Without Tikhvin, the Soviets had no highway. No highway meant no way to traverse the dense forests and swampy terrain of northeastern Russia. Now Leningrad was truly alone, and starvation began. Entire families struggled against the incessant, gnawing hunger. Many succumbed. An 11-year-old girl named Tanya Savicheva recorded the demise of her own family in heartbreakingly stark terms. Zhenya died on December 28th. Grandma died on January 25th. Leka died on March 5th at 5 in the morning. The Savichevs are dead. Everyone is dead. I am all alone. Tanya would eventually escape Leningrad, but would not live to see the end of the war. She died on July 1st, 1944, of intestinal tuberculosis. She was only 14 years old. The city she left behind plunged into despair. In the words of historian Anna Reid, Leningraders resorted to their most desperate food substitutes, scraping dried glue from the underside of wallpaper and boiling up shoes and belts. Some went to even more extreme lengths. Devastating stories of cannibalism emerged from the city. A mother who murdered her toddler to feed her 3 children. A husband who killed his wife to keep his sons and nieces alive. Around 1,500 Leningraders were arrested on suspicion of cannibalism. Some were executed on the spot. A survivor named Alexander Sasha Mikhailovich recalled, "A woman approached me. She promised me bread, sweets, and other treats. I believed her. I was hungry. My auntie saw me dragged into the woman's flat and called a policeman. The woman was arrested, her flat searched, and they found human remains, some half-eaten. She was taken outside and shot." Even those who did not resort to cannibalism were driven close to madness. Natalia Uskova remembered lying in bed listening to the radio and suddenly feeling like her head was expanding, as if it would burst on her shoulders. She desperately wrote in her diary, "Am I losing my mind?" Others approached the futility of their situation with pitch-black humour. Dmitry Lazarev was cheered to hear his daughter and niece singing "Mary Had a Little Lamb" together, but listening closer, he learned what the girls were really singing. It doesn't rhyme particularly well when translated from Russian to English, but the words are understandably chilling. And for supper, clearly, I'll need a little baby. I will take the neighbour's, steal him from his cradle. Even a city as resilient as Leningrad could not go on like this. Supply convoys had to start flowing again. which meant Tikhvin must be retaken. But even if it could be, winter was coming. Winter meant a lake choked with ice and no ships. In the settlement of Kobona, Lake Lagoda narrows around 30 kilometers, dividing this Soviet-held village from Leningrad on the western shore. In the early morning hours of November 17th, 1941, a team of hydrographers and scouts inches its way out onto the ice. So early in the winter, the ice itself is treacherously thin. Each step could mean plummeting into the lake below or being spotted by a Luftwaffe patrol and destroyed. Nonetheless, they must push on. Lieutenant General Zakhar Kondratiev watches their progress nervously. Danger lurked at every step. The ice was cracking menacingly. At the 5th or 6th kilometre from the shore, the wind increased to a gale. The ice became thinner, sagged more noticeably, and the first cracks appeared. They strapped themselves with ropes. Everyone kept a close eye on his comrade, ready to rush to the rescue immediately. Progress is agonizingly slow. Then disaster. They're spotted. Enemy artillery opens up, tearing great holes in the ice. But the men keep on, shivering, freezing, terrified, shells bursting around them, the frozen mass of the lake heaving beneath their feet. A day later, by some miracle, they are on the opposite bank at Vaganova, finally within the perimeter of the encircled Leningrad. It can be done. The frozen lake can be crossed. Supplies begin moving across the ice almost immediately. Military Road number 101, the Road of Life, is the only thing keeping Leningrad alive. But it's just keeping the city on life support. To revitalize this urban siege, Tikhvin must fall. As December bit down hard, the Germans at Tikhvin were struggling to hold on. Decimated by Soviet fire and brutal winter conditions, their situation was dire. Von Lieb immediately understood what needed to be done. They must withdraw from Tikhvin or face utter annihilation. Hitler was furious, but reluctantly agreed, and so the Germans pulled out on December the 8th, leaving a reported 7,000 dead behind them. Tikhvin was back in Soviet hands, and the Road of Life was open for business. Throughout the winter, goods flowed into Leningrad, but this journey was still a perilous one. The vehicles caused what the Soviets called resonance oscillations, which split previously reliable areas of ice. After losing several trucks to the deathly waters of the lake, strict speed limits were introduced. The lake and its surrounding area became a sophisticated network of transport and logistics, with road signs, bridges, repair workshops, and medical aid stations. At its height, some 1,779 kilometres of road crisscrossed the area. Managing all this were the White Angels, a group of mainly female personnel who stood out on the route with flashlights and guided the trucks. Unfortunately, their lights guided German planes too. Many of the White Angels were blown to pieces, or left to drown after falling through ice, shattered by Luftwaffe pilots desperately trying to stop the trucks. But they stuck with their task, and by December 23rd, 800 tons of supplies were rolling across the lake each day. But this still wasn't enough to keep the city fed. By the new year, bread rations had fallen to 3.5 ounces per day for engineers and factory workers, and for the rest, it was 2.5 ounces, basically a single slice of bread for 24 hours. So the Soviets stepped up their work. Each driver was given the target of 2 crossings a day. 261 hit this target in January 1942, reaching 627 in March. But then spring brought faint glimmers of hope to Leningrad. With the warm weather, citizens could grow vegetables. The kitchen gardens flourished across the city. This wasn't so much dig for victory as it was dig for survival. Spring became summer and the famine eased. Life was almost tolerable in Leningrad. But could she survive another winter? No one wanted to take that chance. The Red Army would have to break the siege. Leningrad could not hold out forever. But then, on a pleasant summer's evening on August 9th, 1942, the white columns of the Philharmonic Society Hall are decked out with lights, and beneath them, filling the space to the brim, legions of Leningraders sit in eager anticipation. Teachers and soldiers sit side by side with party functionaries and factory workers, all here to witness a special event. A performance of Dmitri Shostakovich's 7th Symphony, simply entitled Leningrad. Conductor Karl Eliasberg, half-starved, stands high upon his rostrum, his fine suit baggy against his emaciated frame. Only 14 musicians remain in the city's once great orchestra, and so its ranks are swelled by anyone who can play. There are fire watchers, soldiers, munitions workers. Some still wear the uniform of battle. All bear the scars of 11 months under siege. But it's a performance for the whole city. Loudspeakers carry its notes throughout the great, stricken metropolis. Some speakers are turned towards the enemy lines. A mischievous act of defiance. The voice of Shostakovich himself drifts across the airwaves. I assure you, comrades, in the name of all Leningraders, that we are invincible and that we are ever at our posts. This was the day that Hitler had hoped to hold his own banquet celebrating the fall of the city, but the message was clear. There would be no Nazi celebration in Leningrad. The city was still here, and here she would stay. But as August faded and temperatures began to fall once again, thoughts turned to another winter. In fact, both sides feared the onset of the season. The Soviets, terrified that another famine would destroy them, regrouped for a final assault. The Nazis, aware of their dwindling momentum, sought to wipe Leningrad out once and for all. For the Germans, Operation Nordlicht, Northern Light, was designed to be the final word in the siege. The lengthy, costly attempt to squeeze the life from Leningrad had been only partially successful, and so now they would smash the city and burn it to the ground. But the German-held land south of Lake Ladoga was only 16 kilometers wide in places. The Red Army was tantalizingly close to breaking the siege, and that January they already tried. A combined assault from the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts had ended in disaster, resulting in the almost total annihilation of the Second Shock Army. But the Soviets were eager to try again before winter returned, and so on August 19th, 4 days before the planned beginning of Nordlicht, the Russians got the jump on their enemy and launched the Sinyavino offensive. 190,000 men, including a revived Second Shock Army, attacked across the Shiselberg salient. By late September, they were almost halfway across, but were dangerously overstretched. The Nazis sensed this, and they attacked, where they were able to cut off and surround the advanced troops. For the second time that year, the Second Shock Army was isolated behind enemy lines. Casualties were horrendous, and the Soviet offensive was truly repulsed. It was a disaster for the Red Army, but it was somehow worse for the Nazis. Nordlicht was shelved, and the Germans would never again mount an assault on Leningrad. And then, on one freezing night on January 18th, 1943, with spring still far away, something strange started happening. Across the city, windows, usually shut tight against the bitter chill, were flung wide. Curtains flapped in the breeze, and gramophone music wafted down the street. There were cheers, sounds of joy, an emotion so nearly forgotten in the dark winter of 1941-42. Leningrad radio had also made an announcement. The ring has been burst open. We have long waited for this day, but we knew it must come. Hours earlier, to the southeast, troops from the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts embraced for the first time in years, as the lead elements of both forces linked up across the Shiselberg salient. An unbroken line now connected Leningrad to the rest of the Soviet Union. But for all the music and celebration, this had been yet another costly mission. 6 days earlier, on January 12th, Soviet forces launched Operation Iskra, Spark, led by the famous general Zhuzhou Zhukov. Facing them on the German side was a new and horrifying weapon, the Tiger tank. These monsters could knock out Soviet T-34s with one shot, burning Russian tanker crews alive in their vehicles. But the boggy terrain made tank warfare difficult, and on the other side of Shiselberg's only north-south road, Tigers floundered in the mire. their crews sitting ducks for the anti-tank squads roaming the country. Towards the end of the battle, the petrol-soaked bog was set alight, transforming the landscape into something truly diabolical. The Soviet soldier Nikolai Vasipov remembers, "The trees were smashed and the air was thick with burning peat. It was an inferno, and I found it hard to ignore the cries of the wounded echoing through the smoke and the trees. It was hell on earth." Against this horrific backdrop, the fortress town of Schisselburg was taken. But now another problem emerged. What to do about its population? Numbering 15,000 at the beginning of the war, most had been starved, extradited to Germany, or simply executed. Now only a few hundred remained. Surely these survivors were true heroes of the Great Patriotic War, hardy souls who had endured the worst of Nazi occupation. Well, not in the eyes of the notorious NKVD secret police. Nikolai Vasipov remembered some residents were none too pleased about their so-called liberation, and instead were wishing to remain living under German control. The NKVD offered another solution, that they need not remain living at all. In Vasipov's account, the survivors were rounded up and marched into Leningrad, where they were shot dead. The Soviets suffered 115,000 casualties taking Schisselburg. In contrast, the Germans had suffered just 12,000 dead, and the hole punched through their salient was rather narrow, only 10 kilometers wide. But so far from home, the Nazis couldn't reinforce, nor could they retake the Schisselburg corridor. For Leningrad, the nightmare was so nearly over, as long as the Red Army could drive home their advantage. Perhaps all that gramophone music was a little premature. The siege was far from lifted. German troops still occupied the area south of Leningrad, while the Finns held their lines to the north. Aware they were losing a grip on the city, German troops stepped up their artillery bombardments, hammering Leningrad more out of spite than strategy. Citizens who had survived this grim hell for nearly 2 years were now being cut down and killed by shells almost pointlessly. Meanwhile, Soviet troops struggled to repeat the success of Iskra. At Krasny Bor in February, 44,000 Soviet soldiers were defeated by just nearly 6,000 of the Blue Division of Spanish volunteers. That same month, Operation Polar Star sought to destroy Army Group North, but this too had fizzled out by April. There was some good news for the Russians, though. Having hedged their bets in 1941, the Finns in the north were about to reap the rewards of their caution. It was becoming pretty clear that Helsinki was on the wrong side of the war. Allied victories at Stalingrad, Sicily and Kursk in 1943 had made this painfully clear, and now they wanted out of their alliance with Germany. So with no fighting on the northern front, the Germans to the south were basically isolated. On January 14, 1944, the Red Army launched the massive Leningrad-Novgorod assault on 3 fronts, aimed at destroying Army Group North and lifting the siege at Leningrad for good. It took 2 weeks for Russian troops to push just 100 kilometers south. But on January 26th, the Moscow-Leningrad Railway was declared open once again, and Stalin proclaimed the siege of Leningrad officially lifted. But there's a common theme running right through the story of the Soviets on the Eastern Front, the theme of colossal victories that seem an awful lot like bitter defeats. At Kursk, the Red Army held off a vicious German counterattack, but suffered an estimated 800,000 casualties in the process. In the chaos of Stalingrad, more than 1 million Red Army soldiers perished, with 40,000 civilians dead. We can add Leningrad to this list. It's difficult to know precisely how many died in what historian Victor Davis Hansen calls civilization's most lethal siege. Some estimates put the total as high as 1.5 million. Between 1/4 and 1/3 of the city's civilian population also lost their lives. Leningrad had not only been shattered, it had been humiliated. The great city on the Baltic had the soul ripped from it, its dignity stripped away, its citizens reduced to eating human flesh, even their own family members, just to stay alive. But in the years that followed, Leningrad became a city of survivors. Among those survivors was Sasha Mikhailov, the young boy who narrowly escaped being a victim of cannibalism during the siege. Sasha lived to become a beloved grandparent and recorded his experience shortly before his death in 2018. Another survivor was Yevgenia Buyanova, the youngster whose own harrowing story began our video. Yevgenia went on to go to school, get married, and then had a son in the city of Leningrad before eventually emigrating to the United States in the 1980s. Both Yevgenia and Sasha remembered the bleakest points of the siege, but also the shreds of positivity they found around them. Yevgenia remembered her mother saving their neighbour by sharing their bread allotment. She said, "We survived by having compassion." Sasha recalled how a stranger gave him and his starving brother bread, despite surely being close to death himself. In Sasha's own words, bread in those days was like gold. Even in the darkest chapters of human history, hope and humanity remain. And few chapters are darker than that which unfolded in Leningrad, where civilian and soldier alike endured nearly 900 days of horror.